the provision of power. And that's been a huge cause of concern across the board for data center developers, right? So here we see the power bottleneck has identified a few shifts, right? The first being location optimization to risk minimization. So first, it used to be data center developers are going to go, they're going to find a good parcel of land, and they're going to just kind of do site due diligence, submit multiple duplicate applications. The first application that hits is the one that they pursue. And this not only increases wait times, it also prevents, I think, data center developers from really getting their projects out of the queue. And site selection itself has now shifted from land availability to power and infrastructure readiness. And we see power demand is almost 10 times the historical rate, and 55% of all utility load in the country is solely driven by data centers, which is a huge amount as far as historical precedent shows or is concerned. And we see grid inflation as well. You know, PJM has seen a 30 gigawatt increase in demand. ERCOT has seen 239 gigawatts of large load. ISO has seen 17 gigawatts of large load just over the last 2 years. And SPP is forecasting over 7.3% of large loads in 2030. And what does this really mean for, timelines, queue reforms, the way that the grid is moving towards ensuring that, yes, power is important. So how do we get it from point A to point B without so many hiccups or so many obstacles that we're seeing right now, with very extended queue times, very extended low likelihood of projects coming out of the queue, data centers causing what essentially is a jam of projects coming out of the queue, right? With grid reform, folks are expecting readiness deposits, right, which average $4,000 per megawatt. The ISOs are definitely moving towards a much more tighter schedule that leaves less room for risk on part of the developers, as well as has expectations that the developers are A, committing to their projects, B, using as much power as they intend to or ask for, and C, reducing the amount of duplicate projects within the queue as well. So we see across the board, we're having a lot of reform on the ISO side, but folks are still scrambling for power. And I think that it is causing a lot of data center developers to sort of shift to what are alternatives here? What can we do to ensure that our demands are being met? And one of those things are behind the meter projects. We've seen a huge rise in behind the meter from, I think, just the last year. The market grew over 30% nationally, where data center developers are really striving for autonomous power consumption. We have different types. So we have these power plants come in as gas, nuclear, renewables, and hybrid mechanisms. So again, it can be on an islanded project, which is a power plant that's solely meant to provide power to these data centers, or it can be a mix of both.
On the gas side, it's been really fascinating to see what is able to be done very quickly using those modular mechanisms. Volta Grid is somebody who's out there doing a lot of this in Loudoun County and across the whole country. Bloom Energy, ABB, STEM. A lot of these groups are just blowing up in that what they're essentially doing is going and looking at a site and then understanding, okay, from the infrastructure that exists and from the capacity studies, how much can I expect to potentially get from the infrastructure right here? And then what do I need to backfill the need of my actual project, right? Or from those who are just data center developers who are focusing on building out something for their various clientele. They have an idea of the different structures, and they go out and see, okay, what of all of these technologies do you see here? Can they get, and when? And then are able to come forth with that sort of plan, which is like, okay, if you want 200 megawatts now, we can do that in 6 months. But then you can also have an additional 200 from the grid, and all kinds of different arrangements like that, which is really cool to see. My background, I used to do off-grid projects for the military, and the technologies that were available then were kind of in their early stages, and now there's just so much out there that makes it so that you can really work with what is available on the ground. And that also leads into another facet, which is when I talk to folks, what they're looking for often is not only the transmission information, but also where natural gas is and where natural gas storage is. And those obviously feed the gas side. Nuclear, we do have nuclear developers as well. They have a few other constraints that are pretty fascinating. But ultimately, the core constraints are the same as renewable energy developers in terms of just being able to inject into the grid outside of providing the baseload power, which may not be needed for, even with the different sizes of nuclear facilities. Data centers don't always need all of them, right? Unless you're talking about a Stargate project that's that massive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, gas is really making a return in the market where folks are really looking to it because it has a high deliverable time. So it can be deployed within, I think, 12 to 24 months, which makes it so easy for data center developers to rely on it. Because compared to queue times, which are now 72 months at least, folks are looking for a quicker build out. And this is the pathway that allows them to do that, right? And it has a high reliability, it has a higher uptime. It is non-carbon free, but they do use it as a bridge. They usually supplement gas production with nuclear that actually has a later deliverable time. I think the time for that is somewhere in the 4 to 7 years. So data center developers are innovating in ways that they can leverage both at the same time to be energy efficient as well as to be power efficient, right? And nuclear is really coming up as what we know to be like the gold standard of data center power, where these SMRs, these small modular reactors, are built within these factories, and they can produce up to, I think, 30 to 300 megawatts per unit, which is a huge amount, right? And we have a lot of companies come up in our market that are looking towards producing microreactors specifically for co-location facilities, specifically for hyperscale campuses. And while the regulatory hurdles remain and the high upfront costs remain, I think we're going to see a very massive shift towards nuclear in the next few years, where data center developers are going to be able to work around these because one thing about the market is that there's a lot of capital investment here. And while data center developers are looking more power, less vacancy, and more pre-leased agreements, it is very likely that within things like phased build out, where you build one building at a time in a campus that will overall take 10 years, that by the time the last campus is live, you can leverage as much nuclear power as you need. But we see similar trends in renewables as well. They're making a huge comeback where we see solar, wind, and battery. Solar remains at the forefront with very fast deployment. And when paired with battery storage solutions, data center developers are able to shave off-peak costs, right? And while wind still remains a bit at the back end and majorly in what we know as virtual power purchase agreements, where states like Wyoming will have data center developers sign a VPPA to sort of leverage wind power, but via the grid. We do see that there is innovation in this sector. So they're using small wind farms on the ground to supply energy. And these are a bit more expensive. They are not as common, but they still exist, and folks are still able to leverage wind as much as they need to. And then I think the last is hybrid, but I know the data center developers are seeing a few hiccups as far as making sure that co-location with the grid happening in an efficient way without any downtime, and B, that the grid is able to navigate cost shifting, because on-site power is supposed to be relatively cheaper, especially with newer models coming in and having you place really hefty deposits, like $4,000 per megawatt, right? So folks are looking towards alternatives. And I think the grid, especially, I think it's PJM and ERCOT who have really moved towards identifying what mechanisms are available for folks who do want to explore hybrid ways to power, is